In December of 2007, the economies of countries around the world, including the United States, began to spiral downward. In just 12 months, U.S. real GDP fell by almost 4%. Now, that may not sound like much of a drop, but even a 1% decrease in real GDP causes more than 1 million Americans to lose their jobs, and that's a whopping number. During this economic storm, the worst of which lasted until June of 2009, some countries fared even worse than the United States. Total production dropped by 5% in Europe and by more than 8% in Japan. Workers who lost their jobs weren't the only victims of the economic downturn. Young people looking for their first full-time job after graduating from high school or college suddenly found almost no employers hiring. And many families lost large portions of their life savings when the value of their investments plummeted. In the United States, the value of household wealth declined by more than $14 trillion. That number is roughly equal to the total income earned by all Americans in a year. Worldwide, the decline in wealth over the worst year and a half of this episode has been estimated at $40 trillion or more. Now, why did this happen? And why have similar, although much milder, economic downturns occurred in the United States once or twice every decade? The answer starts with an exploration of business cycles. So in this module, the key idea we focus on is that economies go through ups and downs as the result of changes in the overall, or what we call aggregate or total, supply and demand for goods and services in the economy. So the objectives are to describe the business cycle and find out exactly what it is and how it works, to explain the general causes of economic expansions and contractions, with the economy growing and shrinking, and to identify the specific causes of the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 that we are just now coming out of. Business cycles are alternating periods of rising and falling real GDP. They refer to the ups and downs in total output observed over relatively short time periods. For example, several months or even a few years. Between 1945 and 2010, the United States experienced 12 distinct business cycles. Now, there are phases to the business cycle, and although no two business cycles are alike, they are all characterized by the same two phases: expansions and contractions. As illustrated in this figure, during the expansion phase of the business cycle, real GDP rises. Generally, rising real GDP is accompanied by a number of favorable conditions. For example, income levels are on the rise, and firms hire more employees, making it easier for people to find jobs. Now, the second phase, let me move to the next one here, is what we call a contraction. And during the contraction phase, real GDP falls. Economic contractions make life much more difficult. Many people have less money to spend, firms hire fewer workers, and more firms go out of business than during an expansion. When a contraction is severe enough to last several months or longer and have widespread effects on production, real income, employment, and sales across the economy, it becomes what we call a recession. Now, there is no consensus on the exact criteria for a recession, but in the United States, the Business Cycle Dating Committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research has the final say of whether a contraction becomes a recession or not. And generally, what they say is that if we experience 2 quarters of negative GDP, that means 6 months in a row of negative GDP, then that is defined as a recession. So contractions don't always become recessions, but sometimes they do, and in a recession, it is a severe contraction because GDP is negative for at least 6 months. So this figure shows the wave-like appearance of the business cycle. When an expansion is ending and the economy will proceed into a contraction, the business cycle is at what we call a peak. And that is shown as the highest point in the cycle. And I believe maybe I had that on the previous screen, so let me go back here because I'm on the wrong thing right now. Let's go back here. Okay. And what you can see here, I'll just point it out on this particular slide for you. the business cycle is at the peak, and so the peak would be right here, what I just circled, and it's the top of the business cycle. Now, that is not the only point that we are concerned about, and so now let me advance to the screen that I was on before. The next point is what we refer to as the trough, okay? And that's the lowest point in a cycle that you can see on this slide. And putting this terminology together, we can say that an expansion starts at a trough and it continues until the next peak, while a contraction starts at a peak and ends at the next trough. Actual business cycles come in all sizes, and expansions usually last much longer than contractions. Since World War II, the average contraction has lasted about 11 months, a little less than a year, while the average expansion has continued for 5 years. The very serious recession that we just came out of, from 2007 to 2009, lasted an unusually long 18 months. So this next figure here shows the 5 business cycles in the U.S. economy since 1980. The shaded periods, the green areas, so for example, if we look at one of the green areas, this green area right here represents the Great Recession. Now notice that that bar is wider because it lasted longer. And any of these shaded periods are contractions. The unshaded periods are what we refer to as periods of expansion. So you can see since 1980, we've experienced 5 economic contractions, with the worst being the one from 2007 to 2009. So the question is, well, what causes business cycles? Why does the level of economic activity fluctuate? That is the subject of debate, but economists agree that business cycles can be caused by 2 types of events: changes in aggregate demand or changes in aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is an economy-wide version of supply, the level of which depends on an economy-wide version of a price. When the prices of goods and services across the economy go up or down, we call this a change in the price level. Aggregate supply is the total output the country's firms are willing and able to produce, contingent on the price level. In the short run, when the price level rises and wages and other input prices don't have time to catch up, firms can increase their profits by selling more. So the level of aggregate supply generally increases with the price level in what we call the short run. However, when we move to the long run, when we move to the long run, an increase in the price level leads the sellers of inputs to demand a corresponding increase in wages and other input prices, which eliminates the incentive to produce more at the higher price level. Likewise, price level decreases typically cause the level of aggregate supply to decrease in the short run, but have no effect on aggregate supply in the long run. As with the supply for a particular good, an increase in aggregate supply means that firms are willing to supply more at any given price level. And a decrease in aggregate supply means that firms are willing to supply less at any given price level. Aggregate supply is based on the cost of production, which varies with the prices and availability of labor and other inputs, and of technology, human capital, and other determinants of productivity. Changes in aggregate supply can cause expansions or contractions. Rather than resulting from decisions by the country's households or firms, many changes in aggregate supply arise from external shocks, which are uncontrollable events or decisions made in other countries. The results can be negative or positive. For example, when an earthquake and tsunami hit Japan in 2011, tens of thousands of people were killed, power plants were destroyed, and ports, roads, bridges, and factories shut down. On the other hand, the influx of capital that came with China's 2010 investments in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Venezuela provided a positive external shock in Latin America. In the United States, key changes in aggregate supply that have caused or contributed to expansions and contractions include weather, the price of oil, and technological changes. So let's look at each one of these individually. The first one we'll focus on is weather changes. While relatively few Americans work in farming today, the influence of the agricultural sector is strong. A single crop, such as corn, for example, is used as an input in thousands of final goods. These goods range from the obvious, canned corn, cornflakes, popcorn, and corn oil, to the less obvious, like diapers, latex paint, animal feed, soft drink sweeteners, and biofuels. When the weather is particularly good for growing corn, production rises and the price of corn drops. This makes firms willing and able to produce more final goods that use corn. Favorable weather can do the same for scores of crops used in millions of products, thereby increasing aggregate supply and fueling an expansion. Poor weather, by contrast, can have the opposite effect, decreasing aggregate supply. For example, floods and droughts can cause a contraction by destroying crops, like we've seen here in Colorado, and thereby making it more difficult to produce goods that contain those crops. The second factor that can affect aggregate supply is changes in the price of oil. Many of the inputs used by U.S. firms come largely from abroad. One of the most important is oil. While we produce a lot of oil in the United States, about 60% of our oil comes from other countries, although that is on the decline. Much of our electricity comes from oil, and we use oil-based fuels to transport virtually every raw material, intermediate product, and final good. When the global price of oil declines, it costs U.S. firms less to manufacture goods and bring them to market. Hence, they are willing and able to produce more output at any given price level, and aggregate supply increases. A variety of events can cause oil prices to rise. These include increased demand for oil by other countries, decisions by foreign governments to cut oil exports, and disruptions of supplies caused by war or other threats. Higher oil prices cause a decrease in the quantity of output firms will supply at any given price level, thus decreasing aggregate supply. The result can be a contraction. The third factor that can affect aggregate supply is changes in technology. Earlier in this chapter, you learned that steady technological change is one force behind long-run economic growth. When the change is especially rapid, it can lead to a rapid increase in aggregate supply and set off the expansion phase of the business cycle. Remember that technological change increases productivity, or output per worker per hour. When labor is more productive, firms find it less costly and more profitable to increase production. Rapid productivity gains from the internet, for example, contributed to the 8-year expansion during the 1990s. Just because firms are willing and able to produce a certain amount of output doesn't mean they will actually produce it. After all, a firm will produce only what it thinks it can sell. Therefore, the total output firms actually produce depends not just on aggregate supply, but also on aggregate demand, the total output that people want to buy. So, aggregate demand is the total amount of domestic output purchased by all sectors of the country's economy, contingent on the price level. Higher price levels lead to lower levels of aggregate demand and vice versa. When you buy a hamburger, you are contributing to aggregate demand. Likewise, when Delta Airlines purchases a passenger jet from Boeing, or when government agencies build new roads or hire more economists, they too are contributing to aggregate demand. So let's explore how changes in aggregate demand contribute to business cycles. Suppose aggregate demand increases. That is, some combination of households, firms, and the government begins to spend more than usual on final goods and services at any given price level. Just as an increase in the demand for hot dogs causes the price of hot dogs to increase, an increase in aggregate demand causes the price level to rise. The higher price level motivates firms to make and sell more, thus increasing real GDP, and an economic expansion is born. But that's not the end of it. For firms to produce more output, they hire additional workers who therefore have more income to spend. The spending of these additional workers causes aggregate demand and real GDP to rise further. This leads to still more hiring and spending and so on. This virtuous cycle of higher spending and productivity increases real GDP and extends the expansion phase of the business cycle. On the flip side, when households, firms, or the government decrease their spending at any given price level, aggregate demand falls. as does the price level, and firms respond by producing less output. It takes fewer workers to produce the diminished real GDP, so firms reduce hiring and lay off some of their current employees. The newly unemployed workers have less income, so their spending drops too, which leads to further decreases in aggregate demand. The opposite of the virtuous cycle of expansion is thus a vicious cycle of contraction. What causes aggregate demand to change in the first place? 3 of the leading causes are changes in household wealth, changes in confidence, and government policy. Let's look first at changes in household wealth. A person's wealth, sometimes called net worth, let me back up there, went ahead. Person's wealth, sometimes called their net worth, is the value of everything the person owns minus what the person owes to others. You may own real estate, artwork, cars, financial assets like shares of stock or bank accounts, and assorted other items of value. You may owe money for debts that include bank loans, student loans, and mortgage loans used to purchase a home. People naturally spend more when they have more wealth. Suppose, for example, you own an old car that you could sell for $5,000 and you have a bank account with $1,000 in it. You also owe your parents $2,000 that they lent you to buy the car. Your wealth would now be equivalent to this. It would be $5,000 plus the $1,000 that's in your bank account. But then you would have to subtract from that the $2,000 that you owe to your parents. And so when you do that, that's going to equal $4,000. And that is what we would call your net worth. So net worth is the assets that you own minus the debts that you owe. Now suppose your old car becomes a hot collector's item and the Vintage Car Guide estimates its value at $70,000. Your wealth increases dramatically to $70,000 plus the $1,000 that's in your bank account minus the $2,000 that you owe your parents, and now your net worth is equal to $69,000. So it's increased dramatically as a result of that. Now, even if the income you're receiving wearing a chicken suit to advertise fried chicken stays the same, you will probably spend more than before, starting with a party to celebrate your incredible luck. The same thing happens across the country when there are widespread increases in wealth. For example, when housing or stock prices rise, the many people who own them are wealthier, so they increase their spending and boost aggregate demand. But when housing or stock prices fall, their owners are less wealthy. They cut back on their spending and aggregate demand falls. The second factor that affects aggregate demand is changes in consumer confidence. People spend less when they are less confident about the future. Have you ever asked your parents to buy something for you and received the answer, "This is not a good time to spend money," or "not in this economy"? They might have been worried about the future and the possibility of a pay cut or job loss. People with these concerns usually prefer to save more than usual, just in case. But saving more means spending less. The same is true of firms. If they become less confident about future sales, they will be reluctant to invest in new capital, hire new workers, or expand their inventories of goods. The consequence is a decline in spending by firms. If enough people or firms lose confidence in the economy at the same time, aggregate demand can drop significantly. Likewise, confidence that the economy is doing well leads people to buy more consumer goods and firms to invest more in preparation for growing sales, all of which increases aggregate demand. Note that in these ways, thoughts about the economy guide reality. Fear about a weak economy weakens the economy, and confidence about a strong economy strengthens the economy. The third factor that can affect aggregate demand is changes in government policy. In the next chapter, you will learn about 2 types of policies that can change aggregate demand: fiscal policy carried out by the government and monetary policy carried out by the central bank. When successful, these policies can smooth out the business cycle and prevent wide swings in real GDP. Sometimes, however, these policies miss their mark due to delays in implementation. For example, if a policy is meant to slow down an expansion, but it doesn't have its effect until after the economy has already slowed down on its own, it can cause a contraction instead. And if a policy that is meant to boost the economy takes effect after the economy is already flying high, it can send the expansion out of control and cause prices to rise rapidly. Earlier in this module, we briefly discussed the serious recession of 2007 to 2009, known as the Great Recession. By some measures, it was the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. But what caused it? Much of what you've just learned about business cycles was part of the story. Some economists believe that an external shock, a decrease in aggregate supply, helped to make the economy vulnerable. In late 2007 and early 2008, oil became increasingly scarce because China, India, and other rapidly growing countries were demanding much more oil than before as their middle classes were growing. Oil prices rose dramatically, from less than $70 per barrel in 2007 to more than $140 per barrel by mid-2008. Firms in the United States responded by producing fewer goods that involve oil in some stage of production or transportation, thus decreasing aggregate supply. The decrease in aggregate supply by itself might have caused a recession, although certainly not the deep one we experienced. But powerful changes in aggregate demand started around the same time. To understand why aggregate demand fell so much and so fast, we have to go back to the years preceding the recession and look at the housing bubble. In the context of economics, a bubble is a rapid and unsustainable increase in the price of homes, gold, corporate stocks, or some other asset. An asset is anything of value that is owned or controlled with the expectation that it will provide benefits in the future. Bubbles arise from a circular logic, as illustrated in the figure that we will look at next. Everyone wants to buy the asset because they think its price will continue to rise. So let's look at what happened here. If you look at the bubble, at this point right here, this is what we're focusing on. Everyone wants to buy the asset because they think its price will continue to rise. All this buying causes the price to rise, just as was predicted. Okay. As prices rise, new potential buyers want to get in on the action, making the price rise further. This continues until the bubble bursts, meaning that the prices that were rising skyward suddenly start falling back to earth. So let's go back to the previous page. From the late 1990s to 2006, the United States and many other countries experienced a housing bubble. But what caused all the demand for homes that set off the bubble in the first place? That's the subject of heated debate, but likely contributors included the following: inadequate government regulation of financial institutions that were providing risky home loans, low interest rates that made home loans temporarily cheap, and speculation by investors that housing prices would only go up. Now, if we go to this next slide here, oops, let me go back here. Let me see, I have the wrong one there. Let me go back. I guess we're good. Okay. But the effect on real housing prices in the United States from 1975 to 2010 was significant. There was a rise in housing prices that began in 1997, and over the next 9 years, the median or middle price of a home, if you range them from the least expensive to the most expensive, in 2011 dollars, it rose sharply from $143,629 to $206,889. Although new homes were built each year, the demand for new homes rose faster than the construction industry could supply them. So prices continued to rise. Homes are an important part of the typical family's wealth. As home prices rose, homeowners felt richer. They saved less and spent more, causing an increase in aggregate demand. As spending rose, firms increased production and hired more workers, providing them with more income. This caused still more rounds of spending. In these ways, the housing bubble helped fuel the economy's expansion from 2001 to 2007. But what happened? Just like a soap bubble, an asset bubble can grow so large before it will burst. And that created the bust because of the burst of the bubble. If nothing else stops it, the price of the asset eventually rises so high that few new buyers find it appealing or affordable. Without enough buyers, the price stops rising. People begin to find the asset less attractive, and some begin to sell it. Then the price begins to fall, so more people want to sell, and the downward tumble of prices continues. The burst of the housing bubble was hastened by another thorny situation. In 2007, after 5 years of rising interest rates caused the size of mortgage payments to rise, an unusually large number of homeowners were not making their payments. This made banks and other financial institutions reluctant to provide new loans for home purchases. Once it became harder to get a loan, the home buying frenzy that created the bubble began to fizzle. Housing prices stopped rising, and as in the standard story of an economic bubble bursting, more and more people wanted to sell their homes and fewer wanted to buy one. This figure shows the dramatic drop in home prices that began in 2007. In some cities in California, Nevada, and Florida, home prices ended up lower than before the bubble began. As house prices fell, millions of homeowners around the country suddenly had less wealth. As you've learned, decreases in wealth lead to decreases in spending. Aggregate demand declined significantly, and this was a major cause of the recession that began in late 2007 and continued for the next 18 months. But it was not the only cause. Once the housing bubble burst and the recession began, several related events made the recession worse by causing further decreases in aggregate demand. One was a financial crisis. While the housing bubble existed, many banks and other financial institutions had invested heavily in housing or lent money to others to buy homes. When housing prices fell, these institutions lost trillions of dollars. Some went bankrupt, and those that survived had difficulty performing the normal financial functions needed to keep an economy running. For example, before the crisis began, many households and firms had plans to borrow money. After the crisis, they were unable to borrow and had to cancel their plans for spending the money. You'll learn more about the financial system and how the financial crisis evolved in the next chapter. The next chapter also details how shares of stock represent partial ownership in a corporation. These shares, like homes, are an important part of wealth for many people. As the recession took hold, stock prices fell as well. This often happens during a recession because falling production brings down profits and makes it less valuable to own part of a corporation. But in the recent recession, stock prices fell even more than usual. From late 2007 to early 2009, stock market wealth fell by more than 40%. This downfall was driven by the growing realization that the recession itself would be unusually deep and long, and the fact that financial companies needed to sell stocks to stay afloat. And finally, the recession of 2007 to 2009 destroyed household and business confidence more than any since the Great Depression. Every month, hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost. Ultimately, 15 million people lost their jobs. News media delivered nonstop bad news. Bank failures, businesses closing, massive layoffs of people from their jobs, and further drops in home prices. TV commentators and even some government officials warned of the possibility of another Great Depression. Those who had jobs worried that they might be laid off, cut back further on, and then they cut back further on their spending. And business firms, uncertain about the economy's future, canceled planned spending on new capital equipment. There are many more questions about the recession of 2007 to 2009 still to be explored. What did the government do to fight the recession? Why did the recession last so long? What did we learn from the experience? You'll discover some answers to these and other questions over the next couple of chapters.